Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jonathan. I'm a part of the team here at the Free Speech Union. I just want to welcome you to this Facebook Live, or if you're joining us via our podcast, it's fantastic to have you here again. You know, here at the Free Speech Union, a quote that we often hear is supposedly from Voltaire, and he said, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Now, this actually wasn't a Voltaire quote. It's a common misconception. It was written by a colleague of his, Evelyn Beatrice Hall, but it's a great concept that illustrates the value of free speech and the fact that often we don't agree with each other. We may actually vehemently oppose what the other party is claiming, but we deeply believe in the value of free speech and the fact that this is what enables us in our pursuit forward for truth and a more cohesive society. Today, we're going to be exploring a rather tricky, hot subject that has been popular in a number of newspapers around the country recently. We're going to be talking about Mātauranga Māori and free speech, science and academic freedom. Where do the lines for each of these important concepts cross? We're joined by three panelists today, and it's fantastic to have them joining us. Harete Hipango is the National Party List MP in Wanganui, and she is in her second term in Parliament. And she is, up until very recently, where we understand a shift has just occurred, but she is the Māori Development, Māori Tourism, Whānau Ora and Oranga Tamariki spokesperson. We're also joined with Professor Natasha Hamilton-Hart from Auckland University. Before joining the University of Auckland, she held positions at the National University of Singapore and the National Australian University. She received her PhD from Cornell in the United States in 1999, and before that was at the University of Otago. And we're also joined by journalist Damien Grant. Now, when I asked how he would describe himself, he said, a second-tier scribe with a spotty past running a third-tier insolvency practice in the semi-industrial wastelands of Albany. That must be an old way of describing yourself there, Damien, because Albany is not really semi-industrial anymore, is it? It's all been chopped up into residential in the North Shore there. But it's fantastic to have this panel with us today. We're going to be discussing the situation of Professors Cooper and Nola of Auckland University. Several months ago, they both were part of a group of academics who penned a letter to the Listener magazine in which they questioned the decision to equate within the NCEA curriculum the concepts of Mātauranga Māori, the corpus of Māori knowledge, and science. They were very careful in their letter. 300 words, it wasn't very long. You can only unpack the concept so much in that space, but they were very careful in that space to not say that Mātauranga Māori had no value. They, on the contrary, they said it was very significant for our cultural landscape and had contributed much to our nation, but that it simply could not be equated with science. And so we've got a number of different commentators who will join us for this discussion here today. Damien, I want to start with you, and feel free, everyone, to just jump in as it feels natural. But Damien, you wrote an article about this situation earlier in the week, and you quoted Albert Einstein. Now he kind of had a similar pile on about 100 years ago, where 100 academics wrote a book claiming why he was wrong, and apparently his quote was, why 100? Why would I need 100 academics? If I were wrong, one would have been enough. And so I wonder if, could you unpack for us what he meant by that, and what's the relevance of that quote to the conversation around free speech?
Well, Einstein was pushing the boundaries in terms of what was conventional physics at the time. And he had his theory of relativity, and the orthodox physicists just disliked and disagreed with it. And so they came up with 100 physicists against Einstein. And his quip was, in the realm of science, simply one person one correct fact can disprove a narrative if the narrative is wrong. And that's what he was referring to. But in reference to this, and why I reached for that analogy, was after the listener letter, the 7 academics who penned it, Associate Professor Wiles and Professor Henley wrote a letter with giving their version, criticising the 7 academics, and they encouraged other academics and people working in the university fields to respond, and they had over 2,000 reply. And to my way of looking at it, if Wiles and Hindley are right, then they're right. They don't need 2,000 other academics to jump on. And it struck me as this was bullying, it was intimidation, it was a means by which they were showing we don't need to be right. We have power and weight and numbers on our side. And so what I was reaching for was the old Enlightenment idea that you don't need to appeal to authority, you need to appeal to reason. And the authority that I felt that Wiles and Hindley were reaching there was, as I said in my column, reaching for the authority of the mob. And so that's why I delved into the Einstein quote, which I think is apt for that situation. And look, it's entirely possible that Wiles and Hindley are correct and the 7 academics are wrong, but they should be able to defend that argument on their own without having to rely on 2,059 other people to back them up.
Yeah, and Professor Hamilton-Hart, you're based at Auckland University there, and so this is a context that you're existing in. What was your take on both the letter that was initially written and then the response to it? Do you feel like the letter that was penned in response to the initial letter to the editor addresses the arguments and tries to engage in it in a reasonable way, or is it kind of, as Damien's saying, they're more about the number of people that are engaging in this conversation?
Well, I thought the original letter raised some interesting claims, regardless of whether one agreed with them or not. I think they were put forward in a very courteous way. I could not see any obvious disrespect to anybody that was put in that letter. And frankly, not that it's always necessary to avoid offending people, but I think you would have had to reach quite hard to genuinely be offended by that letter. So I was quite dismayed when I saw the response from 2 of my colleagues, because it wasn't just the issue of what Damien called summoning the mob. It was also the fact that the letter itself is not an example of reasoned debate. It is a statement of contrary beliefs, and saying basically they said, well, these people are wrong, and they make a series of claims about the nature of science and the nature of Mātauranga Māori, but they don't actually bring any particular reasoning tools or evidence to try and rebut and engage with the claims that the original letter to the listener made. And to me, that meant that it wasn't just that they were, appealing to authority. They were more like appealing to faith. And it reminded me in an odd sort of way of, the sort of the Trumpland approach of, well, you have your claims, but we have alternative facts. And of course, Wiles and Hindley were claiming a great deal of authority for their version of the truth. But it was simply a statement of belief. We hold these things to be true. And so it wasn't an example of debate, in my view.
Well, and that's what we would call an orthodoxy, a faith that we hold and a truth that we believe in, but one that is relatively unassailable. You're not supposed to challenge it. Is that consistent with your role as an academic, or the roles of the 2,000 academics who joined in on this letter?
Well, look, in theory, of course, all academics are schooled with the idea that, all knowledge is provisional, all theories are up for being tested and may be overturned at some time. But of course, everyone is human as well, and everyone likes to gatekeep and defend their turf and sort of say, well, I'm right and Professor so-and-so is wrong, and that's part of normal life. The point is, if you think you're right, and, you need to put up and, show why your experiments and your conclusions or your time in the archives or whatever it is you've done in terms of research and the pursuit of knowledge, show why it is robust to the criticisms that are being made. And that is how either orthodoxy gets overturned or it doesn't. But to me, that's fundamentally what we're doing in a university. And we can't afford to have orthodoxy in place, not just as the prevailing wisdom. This will always exist in different schools, but to cut off the possibility of challenging it. And that is what I find really disturbing.
Mm-hmm. Harete, your background is, you come from a legal background and you've had a lot of experience in that space. So you haven't engaged in the academic environment quite as much, but of course your heritage is seeped in Te Ao Māori. Kind of from a kaupapa Māori perspective, what's your impression of this? You may not be able to speak to an exact definition of Mātauranga Māori, but as a wahine toa that you are, what was your impression of the letter and the situation that is emerging, the expulsion of Professors Cooper and Nola and all this?
Kia ora, Jonathan, Natasha, Damien, and everyone who's listening in. First of all, a disclaimer. I don't come from a scientific background. As you've said, Jonathan, legal background. And my area of practice is with people, so family, child welfare, mental health. So just giving context to that, and then giving service in Parliament as a representative of the communities that I come from. So you've talked about the context of how I view the world from both a Te Ao Māori, but also a Te Ao Tauiwi. So my heritage is, yes, it's Māori, but my heritage is also from a genealogical premise, Celtic, Irish, Scottish, New Zealander. So I've been framed and shaped within the worldviews of both my mother's and my father's values, Māori and New Zealand, drawing on that context. I'd just like, if I may, to pick up in answering what you've talked about. This debate is very much, in my view, our shared view about the ability to have opinions and to freely express and view those without an oppressive, suppressive culture that we seem to have besieging the nation at the moment. Damien, if I may come to a point that you raised in your article too, your written article in response to the letters from the 7 professors, academics, you made a comment that there is no authority in numbers. Now I'm going to just come to the context of the environment I've been in Parliament, where we've had legislation rushed through under urgency just last week, the COVID-19 Public Health Response Bill. There was definitely authority in numbers because the government has the numbers, it has the power, and it chose to, despite the importance of representing the best interests and welfare of New Zealand, didn't do that by being open to decent engagement, consultation, hearing robust debate with an alternative point of view. It was set in its mind, the government, we know best, we're telling New Zealanders this is what's going to happen to you, whether you like it or not. And so we've had legislation that's been rushed through where there's been plenty of time, the traffic light system, which the whole country now, and particularly Auckland, as you've been living under this lockdown siege, for whatever reasons, everybody has their view on it. But it's really important that people do have the ability to express and have the freedom to articulate those views, and that there is that, and opinions, and that there is robust exchange, a debate, an opportunity for alternative viewpoints to be respectfully acknowledged. So we've got a government at the moment that has set the standard, is the exemplar for not being respectful, in my view, for not heeding alternative views and factoring that in the decisions that have been arrived. So coming back to this very issue, it's contentious because a couple of factors. One is that those who have dared to tread where others may not are quite entitled to express their view and opinion, and have done so, I believe, in from what I've read and the letter, in a respectful way. It hasn't, in my view, from what I've read again, and I don't come from a science background, I put that into context, that their expression is that their opinion is that Mātauranga Māori is not a science. So looking at it from a scientific and a Mātauranga Māori view, it would be better, rather than having a woman who's practiced in law articulating this. I can speak on the freedoms and the legalities and the constitutional basis for those rights to be able to freely express an opinion, to freely move, with limited justifications, of course. The Mātauranga Māori aspect is that some have seen that the academic's opinion was diminishing the relevance of Mātauranga Māori. I didn't see it that way. I saw that they viewed that Mātauranga Māori is premised on a knowledge framework and base from that cultural context, but in the paradigm as they view it as academics and scientists, the two don't marry up. Mātauranga may be complementary and there are things that could be gained from it, but the understanding of science is about proving the what's, the why falls.
That's a really interesting comment that you make there, Harete. And I just want to draw in two quotes from the complaints that are being made at the Royal Society at the moment. So both Professors Nola and Professors Cooper are under investigation by the Royal Society for their role in penning this letter, and they've been investigated under the Code of Conduct. And there are two complaints that have been made. There were 5, 3 of them have been dropped, but in one of them, the complainant notes that I feel that the opinions expressed throughout the letter are below standards required to be of good character because they have caused harm to Māori and Indigenous colleagues and communities. Specifically, I believe that their opinions denigrate Indigenous knowledge when they state that Indigenous knowledge may indeed help advance scientific knowledge in some ways, but it is not science. Speaking as tangata whenua, do you believe that these comments have denigrated your mana in that way?
And again, in the wider context, I'll only speak from how I view and perceive it without that science background. But certainly, I didn't see anything denigrating or disrespectful in the expression of a written opinion and view relating to that. I am concerned about the strong arm approach that's not just happening with this investigation deemed to be warranted. I just see it coming through in other spheres at a central government level as well. So if anybody dares to tread in territory that is against the deemed authority, suddenly you have the oppression and the suppression of numbers that come in and tell you opinion. And I get it constantly as a public figure, particularly in social media. And I know that with public office, we are subjected to scrutiny, but that scrutiny, in my view, should be respectful. It should debate the merits of the view that's held and not attack the mana or the integrity of the person. That happens too much. So is it denigrating? That's, and again, the context from which that comment is made, were the opinions of the academics seen to denigrate the context of and actually the value of Mātauranga Māori? I didn't see that. I don't read into
Damien,
it.
I want to just share with you another quote from the complaints that are made and put this to you. Another one of the complainants wrote, "I do not believe that the statement released by the Royal Society Te Aparangi is sufficient in managing the harm caused by the listener article. If there are no repercussions to fellows making poorly researched anti-Indigenous statements with more authority than they are qualified for, it puts forward a poor image of the society." Both of these quotes buy into this notion that these ideas and the statements that have been expressed are causing real harm both to academics, Indigenous and Māori academics within the space, but probably more generally to tangata whenua widely. How do you perceive this argument that these ideas are causing harm and the response that is then needed for that?
So what if they are? I mean, if you are pursuing a line of inquiry and that line of inquiry is hurtful to somebody's worldview or to their sense of themselves or whatever, then okay, that's unfortunate, but it's also irrelevant. I mean, I would be disappointed if the scientists were going out there and say, you know, these people are for whatever reason just bad or evil or horrible. But if you are conducting a line of research that is uncomfortable for other people to hear, then that is not a reason for that line of research to be shut down. So let's say somebody is to do a line of research that says, people with a criminal past are forever tainted and can never be redeemed or reformed. All right. I would not particularly like to hear that line of inquiry. It would be challenging and distressing for me to hear. But if that's a line of inquiry, the fact that it is distressing and hurtful and harmful to me to hear does not mean it is a line of inquiry that is invalid, does not mean it's a line of inquiry that should not be followed. And so the idea that you are pursuing a line of inquiry that I or somebody else finds distressing or hurtful, therefore you must cease that line of inquiry, is chilling and wrong. I also think it's interesting that after my column was published, I had around 10, 11, 12 academics reach out to me privately. And there was a constant theme. About 3 or 4 of them made the comment that they are just keeping their heads down because, as a head of their department signed the Wales-Hindley letter. And I'm a little bit surprised and a little bit disappointed to see I'm not too sure what the right. I'm sure fear is overhyping it. But there is a degree of self-censorship that is kicking into our academia, at least based on the very limited sample set that reached out to me. That may not be representative of the wider institution, of course. But I think the other thing that the people who make these protests, Wiles and Hindley, and there's lots of, I don't mean to pick on them necessarily, but they are the focus. They wrote the letter. If you can engineer a situation where you are either offended or you are championing some persecution of somebody else on the basis that some other group may be offended, you are actively rewarded for that. And one thing we know for certain is that people respond to incentives. And so if we reward people for organising a mob or a petition or seeking to silence ideas that they don't like, you are going to see more of it. So it may simply be what we are seeing is that people who act in the way that Wiles and Hindley were doing are rewarded for that behaviour, and so we are going to see more of it.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting. Sorry, please jump in there, Harete. Yeah.
May I pick up on that point that Damien's made? It's interesting, these academic professors, are they Māori? I'd be interested to hear, a robust point of view from a Māori scientist academic, blending the concept, the knowledge, the construct of what Mātauranga Māori is, and to hear the debate as to the paradigm and the definition of science. And this is sometimes where the worlds do have a tension and a clash. But I frankly do tire of hearing from those who haven't lived in the world, a Māori world, suddenly take on that sense that they have the responsibility to articulate and to advance it. I would like to hear the opinion coming from a Māori scientist working in this space, Māori academic working in this space, as to the tensions, why the tensions are there, and how we can respectfully work through those differences. Because often out of differences, you do come to a mutual meeting place of being able to advance the ground. And
that's a very interesting point you raised there, Harete. And of course, Professor Cooper is himself Māori and has taught kaupapa Māori there at the medical school and other places for over 30 years. So, there certainly the Free Speech Union, if I can speak for us, we are up for that discussion taking place. It is not that we have a predetermined position one side or the other, but exactly it is that conversation needs to be allowed to function and let the right people speak. Damien, I want to go back to your points with regards to the anecdotal comments that you've received from academics. The Free Speech Union is currently commissioning some research being done by Courier Research to examine the opinions of both students and lecturers in universities across the country. So we'll have a scientific poll released before the end of the year exploring that. And it will be really interesting, I think, to see what kind of self-censorship is underway in our universities and the pernicious effect that will be having on our capacity to explore these really tricky questions. Professor Hamilton-Hart, I just wanted to come back to a more technical distinction there. As we contacted over 20,000 academics around the country 2 weeks ago discussing this issue, many of them replied saying that we had misconceived the notion of free speech and academic freedom. And of course, we appreciate that they are not one and the same, that academic freedom sits within free speech, but it's not the same thing. I was wondering if you could unpack that for us a little bit and kind of distinguish between these two and what it means for you as an academic to have both free speech and academic freedom.
Well, I mean, definitional debates get very boring, but I think the substantive distinction that people might be trying to drive at is the right you have as a citizen, or anybody in this country, to state your opinion however you arrived at it and in whatever terms you feel like. So if you look at what goes down on Twitter, there's a lot of stuff that is just plain rude, not well thought out. Nobody bothers with evidence very much, or not nobody, but pretty much. But that is the sort of price of being in a society where there are very few restrictions on speech. And your right to speak doesn't mean that you have to be credentialed, and you don't have to always formulate your arguments in careful terms and be very precise about what you mean and all of those things. Academic freedom, I think, refers to both the privilege and the obligation that comes with being a specialist who is paid generally by the taxpayer to be in pursuit of knowledge. And that means that you are given more of a social license, quite explicitly in our Education Act, to test received wisdom, things that may not go down well at church or in your community. But if you think there is a reason, within your discipline, reason for asking this question, you are able to do so, even if it isn't socially approved of. There may still be research ethics rules that you have to abide by in terms of how you do that, how many animals will you kill, or whatever. But the obligation, on the other hand, which I think may have been what the people who are writing to you were getting at, was that if you're speaking in your capacity as an expert on an issue, you have an obligation to not claim expertise that isn't yours. That you have an obligation to not misrepresent the state of your discipline. This is basically about being honest as a researcher, but therefore also to the extent that you might be weighing in on things that the ordinary layperson doesn't have knowledge on. If I'm listening to a physicist or an aircraft engineer and I, want an opinion on whether the aircraft is safe to fly in, I am really going on their authority because I have no independent ability to assess their expertise. So I think the responsibility that comes with academic freedom is to be careful about what you're saying and be able to back it up with reference to the actual knowledge base of the area that you research in. Now, that said, there is, of course, a really grey area because academics also are citizens, and they also have opinions that will often lie outside of the boundaries of their very narrow field of expertise. And I don't think academics lose their opinions as citizens, as parents, as members of society, just because they also happen to have an academic job. However, I think that the writers of the listener letter all had extremely impressive credentials on the issue, on the question of to be able to speak about what is the scientific method, and to what extent do other bodies of knowledge and other types of knowledge, which they did not dismiss as having no value, to what extent do they meet the definitions of what counts as the scientific method? Because nobody, I think, would claim, for instance, that religious knowledge forms part of the scientific corpus. But that doesn't mean that you dismiss religious knowledge as having no value. So to say it's not scientific or isn't arrived at through a process that we would recognize as approximating the scientific method doesn't mean to say that it has no value. It might have immense cultural meaning, be hugely psychologically important for people, and valuable, which is entirely consistent with what the listener letter writers wanted to say.
Absolutely. Now, within universities around the world, this distinction between academic freedom and free speech and the orthodoxies that we discussed earlier, these are questions that are coming to a head in many places. One university that has had quite a unique approach has been the University of Chicago, which, in comparison to many other universities in the United States, which have passed speech codes and prohibited certain conversations or speakers or whatever it is occurring on their campuses, the University of Chicago has remained very adamant in their dedication for free speech and allowing that academic context and within liberal education to spark some very interesting, if difficult, debates. I wonder if you could outline for us just the Chicago principles. This is a body of principles that they've released that kind of dedicates their institution to facilitating free speech, and whether you think we need to introduce this within the New Zealand context.
Yeah, the Chicago principles basically make it explicit that in the university environment where you are both in pursuit of yourself, truth as a student, but also the faculty members are also in pursuit of knowledge, you can expect to hear things that you find offensive and uncomfortable. And that in itself is no reason for having to, put up with it. You don't have to go and listen to that speaker, but you can't try and prevent the speaker from speaking. So the Chicago principles basically say, in the university environment, you're entitled to debate and investigate any matter that presents itself, but you must do so within certain norms of being civil. Do not just resort to calling names. Do not attempt to shout down a speaker that you disagree with. Do not make threats or actually try and personally intimidate somebody because of their views. So there are sort of norms of that are really important of, not bullying, intimidating, harassing, and not engaging in name calling. But simply being offended is not a reason for a particular line of inquiry to go forward, not to go forward. And I think this is really pertinent at the moment because New Zealand universities, like many overseas, are in the process of rolling out codes of conduct, such as the one that the Royal Society itself came up with just with a new code of conduct in 2019. And many of these codes are couched in the language of avoiding harm. And they're very explicit to say, and that includes emotional harm and that includes cultural harm. Now that raises a whole lot of issues about how on earth you would measure it and ascertain whether it's real. The question that Damien put forward is, well, then you're incentivizing people to kind of, play this game and use an allegation that this is harmful as a way of shutting down debate. That's one concern. But the other concern, which is very much in line with what you said, Damien, is it is often the case that new ideas are profoundly disturbing and could, without perhaps exaggeration, be said to be harmful. And if we go back to the beginning of the whole scientific revolution and say, when Galileo was putting forward the idea that, in fact, maybe the sun didn't revolve around the earth, this was actually deeply unsettling. It was heretical. This is why he spent the last 2 decades of his life under house arrest and had to go through the Inquisition, because, in fact, what he was saying, the knowledge that he was putting forward, was harmful to the hierarchy of the church at the time and the entire worldview that they had established. We fast forward a few centuries and Darwin's theory of evolution. This was profoundly unsettling, and yes, you could say harmful to certain versions of Christianity that prevailed at the time that said, no, that's not how species came about, right? This is an affront to a body of religious knowledge at the time. So, you could say, well, the whole of Western society has been struggling with the loss of the sacred ever since Darwin's ideas got lodged in society. But it would be a pretty tall ask to say, well, therefore we should go back and sort of try and reverse and unknow what we know. I mean, I think actually one of the religious insights is once you have eaten from the tree of knowledge, you can't put it back in the box. But that doesn't mean to say knowledge isn't dangerous. It's just
I do recall
even more dangerous.
recall from my Catholic education the very clear message from the Christian brothers is those who turn away from the truth shall burn. So there was no ambiguity there that my soul would be damned forever if I was to abandon my faith, which sadly I did.
Damien, I wonder if I can just draw you a bit further on a comment that you made in the piece that you wrote. You know, as the Free Speech Union, we consistently assert that free speech is not just another civil liberty like many others that we enjoy. It is the bedrock on which our civil liberties are founded, and from that spring our right to academic inquiry, our freedom of the press, our freedom for religion. And it comes from this fact that we believe we are allowed to hold our opinions and to express our opinions. And so within the liberal democratic society that we exist in, public institutions have a responsibility to respect these fundamental liberties and freedoms. And you note in your article that the Royal Society Act says that the Royal Society it's not a private organization free to admit and expel whomever it pleases. It's a creation of statute. The Royal Society of New Zealand Act of 1997 was a successor of earlier legislation from the 1960s, and actually the original status reaches all the way back to the 1660s when Charles II first established the Royal Society in the United Kingdom. So, and Harete, we might draw you in on this as well. This is a legal question that you can maybe comment from your expertise, but how does it relate to the fact that this is a public body and must respect the rights that we have as Kiwi citizens?
Well, the Royal Society receives about $8 million from the Crown in various aspects. But the thing that interests me is when I was looking at one of the complaints against there was 3 Royal Society members, sadly one of them has passed on, so there's only 2 now facing it. There is a challenge there that because of the contents of the listener letter, that they are not individuals of good character. Now, if the Royal Society was the Birkenhead Backgammon Society, then they can expel whoever they like. It's a free society. But the Royal Society is now a creature of statute. And I have some experience with being excluded from statutory organisations on the basis of my questionable character. And it seems somewhat unfair to compare these 2 outstanding academics with my own somewhat lowly situation. I was refused membership of a professional body on the basis of my historical convictions for dishonesty, and I had to go to the High Court and argue the issue of my character. And it strikes me that the Royal Society are going down exactly the same track. This is an organisation that may not have been created by statute in New Zealand. It certainly now exists as a function of statute. And if the Royal Society believes that they can apply a rubric of bad character against individuals for their relatively uncontroversial opinions about what is the definition of science, then I think the Royal Society has got some serious internal systemic issues. And I also note, and this is really interesting, there was a blog post by the Wellington Royal Society, very critical of the stance taken by the national body. And I'd be interested whether, Natasha, you're a member of the Royal Society or not, or aspiring to be. But that particular viewpoint, the Wellington Society's rebellion, if you like, has gone. It was removed. David Kuman from the Free Speech Society sent me a link, and I went and read it, and then 2 or 3 days later it was gone. So I think the Royal Society has a problem. If you have a look at their charter and their rules, I think that they believe that they do have the right to expel these people. But I think they're going to find if they pursue this thing, if it goes to court, that the Royal Society are going to lose. And as I said in my column, it will be a moment of considerable pride when my own case will be cited in the inevitable hearing. But I think it is a tragedy that the Royal Society, which to be fair has its own issues, you know, there's issues about slavery and eugenics and other bits and pieces. I'm not saying it's a perfect organisation, but it is an incredibly important organisation, and what it stands for is important, and what it represents is important. And I feel a sense of shame, a sense of loss to see this organisation self-tarnished itself, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Harete, I wonder, as a member of Parliament, as someone who stands within our legislative body and has overview of these public institutions, do you have an opinion on whether the society is operating in a way that truly embodies and respects the rights that, as Kiwi citizens, our democracy has been founded on?
Look, you've put me on the spot, and I'm sorry, I exited because my battery was running low. I've just plugged in and I'm recharging. And as Damien's been talking, I've been listening, and I've just brought up a copy of the Act. And looking at Section 18 of the Royal Society of New Zealand Act 1997, revocation of membership or fellowship. Interesting. It's on the basis that that person or organisation is not adhered, so the people who are the subject of the complaints have not adhered to the Code of Professional Standards and Ethics of that organisation. Now, I don't have a copy of those, but it's the fact that these academics and also members of the Royal Society have expressed an opinion, others have disagreed with it, and that they've found fit, they've seen it appropriate to lodge a formal complaint to take them to task. What happened to the good old days where you could just have a good old debate and have it out there in the open? And coming back to your earlier comment about me as tangata whenua, I was born of a heritage that relates back to my Māori ancestry. So many New Zealanders would say that we too are tangata whenua. But I'll connect back on my cultural genealogical stance and take on the exchange of views. So as Māori, on the marae, when we have manuhiri, we welcome onto the marae, and those of us who are tangata whenua or mana whenua, haukainga of the people of that host marae, our visitors come on in that open space, marae atia. It's the opportunity for that free exchange of views, whether we agree with them or not. People can safely articulate, express it. If we disagree with it, of course, there is the counter argument and debate that goes on. And the exchanges, there have been times when it has been very, very confrontational, but it always ends on the note of people have aired their views, their expression. There's been the opportunity, and it's been afforded that respectful exchange, even though we may disagree. There'll be another time that we'll continue it. And it has been open and aired, and we finish that off and bring it back to a peaceful conclusion. So I'm just going to bring it back to your comment about me as a parliamentarian. Yes, I am, but I'm also a person of the community. And this is about, there's always consequences with whatever action we choose to engage in or to express, but you have to look at the reasonableness of it and the level of accountability that goes with it. So coming back and looking at, I don't know what the professional code of ethics is and conduct for the society, but whether this complaint is going to go so far as being investigated, I think it should be brought back to the fact academics, they've expressed an opinion. It's interesting that they chose to do it in a letter, putting it out there. One has to question why they didn't feel safe enough to be able to express this within the institution that they work within. And it's also interesting as well, because there are some real constitutional issues here. And that comes back to Bill of Rights issues. And I talked earlier about justified limitations in terms of the exchange, whether there is the extent of the harm. It's going to be interesting if the Auckland University is going so far as, and the Royal Society is going so far as, some professional consequence for these people speaking out. There are some real constitutional legal issues that would need to be addressed as well. But before I move on to that, can I just say, in terms of the construct of Mātauranga Māori and the academics expressing the view that this is not science, I bring it back again to what is that construct and paradigm? Who's thinking values-based, scientific assessment, evidence, means and testing? Is it that defines what science is? So I'm not a scientist, but I'm again speaking from the construct of, and there will be the view that some of these academics have expressed it in a colonial context. So bringing from another dimension, another part of our world, our global setting and construct, those values and the paradigm of what science is. So, and people will talk about a decolonizing aspect to that. I'm just going to take it back to the basics. In Aotearoa New Zealand, constitutionally, our country and the formation of it and the fabric of we as peoples of a diverse nations who have come to this land, Treaty of Waitangi was the fundamental constitutional foundation of the fabric of how we stand and interact with each other. So it's well known, the 3 articles of the Treaty of Waitangi, that there have been court determinations as to what the nature and the extent of this relationship is to be redefined to. And it's the 3 Ps, that of partnership, that of participation, and that of protection. So when there are people who are talking about the construct, the paradigm of the definition of what science is and how Mātauranga Māori fits into that, I think it all blends into those issues that I've talked about. Who is constructing this concept of science? What is it? How are the two actually mutually complementary? And how do we move forward with this? And I think that's what's missing in this debate. How do we mutually look at what can be gained as opposed to continuing to oppress and suppress the differences of opinions that we have?
Well, I think that's a brilliant place to kind of bring this conversation to a close there, Harete. And just as you're saying there are some really tricky questions here. The ultimate conclusion of this investigation has not been set yet. We don't know where this story will end. But if we can't engage in good faith conversations and a reasonable dialogue that actually opens out these differences of opinions and allows us to air our agreements and our disagreements, then actually there's no path forward. And so I want to really thank the 3 of you for joining us this afternoon. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I'm sure this isn't the end of it, so hopefully we'll get to come back to you at some point. But Professor Hamilton-Hart, Damien Grant, and Harete Hipango there, thank you each for joining us and giving your time.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you.